All right, let's get started. We wish to welcome you to the final presentation in the noon lecture series of the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies for winter term 2024. The series will resume in fall term 2024, and a lecture schedule will be available at that time. Today's presentation will be given by Professor Wang Feng, who currently holds the position of Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Irvine. Professor Wang Feng is a scholar with expertise in China's social and demographic changes, social inequality, and of comparative population and social history. He is the author of multiple books and many articles in professional journals, books, and other major media outlets. His works and views have appeared frequently in major global media outlets. He has served as an expert for the United Nations, the World Bank, and the World Economic Forum, among many others. His multifaceted professional service includes terms as chair of the Department of Sociology at the University of California, Irvine, senior fellow in foreign relations and in global development at the Brookings Institution, a leading think tank in the United States, and the director of the Brookings Tsinghua Center for Public Policy in Beijing. He is an elected member of the Sociological Research Association, an honor society for sociologists in the United States. He's also an elected foreign member of the National Academy of Italy. Professor Wang Feng is a graduate of the University of Michigan, the first from mainland China, receiving a PhD degree in social sciences at the UFM. Today, he will be speaking on China's Age of Abundance, Origins, Ascendance, and Aftermath. Please join me in welcoming Professor Wang Feng back to Ann Arbor.
Thank you, Professor Zhou Yun. David, is this on now? Okay, great. I'm delighted to be back here in Ann Arbor after a very long journey, along with the Age of Abundance in China. I want to begin by giving a quick salute to many of my mentors here at the University of Michigan. Among them, of course, Marty White, who was on my committee, and very befittingly, Ken Lieberthal, with whom I worked for 3 years at the Brookings Institution. He was my boss, and he opened many doors in Beijing and elsewhere in China, and that also helped with writing this book. David? Huh. Okay. You guessed it. So this young person was me in 1986. I think third year in graduate school here at Michigan. And I was holding that Time Magazine Man of the Year issue and showing the person whom is very relevant to what I will share with you in the next 40 minutes or so. It is really remarkable that since I arrived in Ann Arbor to begin my own learning, the journey, that we've seen China transformed into a country that's totally unrecognizable for those who went to China or who were born, raised in China, and came to this country 40 years ago, right? And the talk is based on the book that just came out with the same title. And it does two things. I try to do two things, okay. One is to document this age of abundance. What happened, right? And there are many books, articles, reports written. Many of them are fragmentary reports, and too many of them relying on numbers that will be unrecognizable in the future, which includes per capita GDP, right? And so these numbers do not really tell us what really happened in China and its impact for the rest of the world. So I try to use consumption data, which are now becoming more and more available, and to document how standard of living have improved for 1/quarter to 1/5 of humanity on Earth. So that's my first inspiration attempt. And the second is try to answer the question of how did this happen, right? That is not an easy task because, well, I walk this through with you and you'll see, right? And so these were the two main goals for working on this book. And I should say the book came out of the COVID-19 confinement because I used to travel in China, work in China, and we all know what happened 4 years ago. And we were confined at home. So that was a great opportunity to sit down and then to compile stuff and to writing also as a diversion of the boredom, of the anxiety. So the book came out during the pandemic. So this is also a COVID-19 pandemic book. First, I want to talk about the age of abundance. The book has a lot of materials on documenting this era. For those who know Chinese or China, the most important thing is food, right? 民以食为天, right? The food is the heaven of people. So we start with food. And I want to remind us at the beginning of this great age of abundance, how poorly people were living, right? And the majority of the Chinese population on the eve of this economic takeoff was living on what's called the margins of subsistence. In 1978, okay, the national nutritional intake was not much better than what it was in the 1930s when John Lawson Buck did the famous agriculture survey in China. The only difference, especially if you look at the rural population, right, working very hard, the only difference between the late 1970s and 1930s was a much more equal distribution of food. So that's how starvation at the national scale was avoided. But recall, during the Great Leap Forward famine, any fluctuation could send China, a large segment of the Chinese population, below the line of subsistence, right? And we have other measures of consumption. And if you look at from the this is like 1965 to 1975 or so, there's little increase in per capita food intake by pork or grain or vegetable oil. And for urban population, the more privileged sector, food was, or other consumer goods were allocated by all sorts of coupons: food, matches, pork, and and others as well, right? And clothing. So it was a country that was quite poor, was more equal, but was quite poor. And then look what happened, right? So between 5 years, between 1978 and or 7 years, 85, look at how food production drastically improved. 30% increase in 5 years in terms of green consumption. And if you look at others, it's the same kind of change. So first of all, with the age of abundance, people started to eat better, eat more, and eat new. And in the book, I talk about Starbucks. talk about the Kentucky Fried Chicken, but here you look at, just look at the dairy products, right? This is a country where 90% of the population are 90% of the population are lactose intolerant, right? And since 2010, China is the largest dairy product importer in the world, accounting for a fifth of the world, the global exports. And there are many other indicators of food consumption. Here I have all sorts of indicators from vegetable oil, from pork to eggs to vegetable oil. But I think you will find this very natural. The most rapid increase is when people get rich, is what? They drink, right? So this is the line. So liquor. So in terms of food, within 5 years after 1978, okay, we'll talk about why 1978, people started to eat more and eat better. And the same thing happened with, So there's no better measure of a population's increase in standard of living, in diet, than height, average height. And here we have average height increase from 1992 to 2012, 20 years, for 7 years old and for 15 years old. But just look at this. Okay, this is for rural girls. It's 8 centimeters in 2 decades. What does this mean? For historical populations, the United States, England, and others, and Japan, the average increase is 2 centimeters per decade. So here we're looking at 8 centimeters in 2 decades. The increase is twice the speed, the pace of historical comparisons. And what's most interesting to me, and I think to a lot of others, is the rapid shrink of rural girls, how the height, their height has increased. So 30 years ago, 40 years ago, you could tell there are regional differences in people's height. Northerners are taller than Southerners, but you can tell in the same place, a person is from the countryside, a person is skinnier, is shorter, especially if that person was a girl. And this is urban boy, rural boy in 2012, and then urban girl, rural girl. You see how the gap has closed so quickly. So this is really a remarkable indicator of how living standards have improved. It's mostly due to improved diet, right? And it's not just, it's not just diet. Look at what people wore. These numbers, this is a photo I took from the internet. These photos are all taken by myself. So during the decades of visiting and field work, back in 1978, on average, people in rural China, 3 persons bought 1 pair of shoes. Okay, this is not to say they only wore 1 pair of shoes, because a lot of them made shoes for themselves. 3 persons bought 1 pair of shoes. And by 2015, China exported 3.5 billion pairs of shoes. That's enough to cover more than half of the world population, actually a third. 40% of those living outside of China. Everybody could wear 1 pair of shoes from made in China, and look at how that changed. And it's not just buying shoes, but also buying luxury goods. By the late 2010s, the Chinese are buying more luxury goods on average, outpacing their share of the world population, and also in terms of per capita income, right? So I gave you a few glimpses of what's called the age of abundance, right? Now we come to the point of how to make sense of this. What happened, right? I want to begin by this photo, not photo, this art piece I took. It's the blind people touching elephants, right? I consider myself one of those blind persons because nobody comes out with a comprehensive picture telling you what really happened in China. I think that's impossible. Certainly not, certainly for me, so I will be one of these people here. This is the elephant. But we do have 4 what we call the prevailing narratives of what happened, right? The first is China's unique. I think we hear about this all the time. China is just different. It's unique. And the second, very common, is, China had cheap labor. China relied on cheap labor. And the third one is, we hear quite often as well, is China's growth was led by opening and reforms, which is basically top-down. The government is in the driver's seat, right? And the last one is oftentimes think the growth was almost preordained. It's irreversible. China was going to get to this stage, and it's going to continue. So these are the 4 narratives. And in the book, and also here, I want to revisit these 4 narratives. The first is China unique? Okay, so there are different ways of looking at this. One is to look at how Chinese improved their standard of living. We began by food, right? This is the cooking oil consumption diet, right? Per capita. And I already showed you earlier, in 5 years, increased by about 4 times, 400%. People start to eat better. And then that's followed by their living conditions at home. So there are many other measures, but here I use one. That is the color TV in urban households and in rural households, and also air conditioner. And you see how after people got enough to eat, their houses are equipped with modern appliances. By the mid-1990s, 100%, the saturation of color TV reached urban households, and then later in rural households as well, and then the urban households start to use air conditioners, make their home comfortable. And once you have enough food to eat and have good housing, what do you do next? You travel, or you own automobiles, right? So this is the automobile starting in the mid-2000s and to 2020. This is the right axis. It's 12 times the increase in households owning automobiles. And what's the next? Overseas travels, right? So again, from the mid-2000s to 2020, we see a 6-fold increase in Chinese going abroad, traveling, right? So this is the path to abundance, from food to international travel in 40 years, right? And this does not differ from how people in other parts of the world improved their standard of living, right? Now, China's cheap labor. What I argue in this book is that China did not have cheap labor, but China had good labor that's made cheap by the Chinese social institutions and the global capitalists, right? This is the improvement in life expectancy prior to the economic reforms, prior to 1980. You see how vertical this increase is in terms of life expectancy at the birth. This is for China. And here I have 2 graphs, one to show health. This is 0 to 4, under 5 mortality. Okay, and this is 1976. Of all the countries that had data available at the time, you plot the GDP per capita and their health level measured by under 5 mortality. And this is the pattern of the time at that time. So China was much below the expected, the regression line. What this means is that China is an outlier, a overperformer, that China's child mortality level was much below what would be suggested by China's low per capita income. So in fact, China's mortality level at that time was even higher than upper middle income countries at the time. So in terms of health, China had a very healthy population compared with international standards at that time. And this was achieved, again, mostly by public health, not by, by more equitable distribution of food, but by public health. So in the book, I have quite a bit of materials documenting how public health during that time, prior to 1978, performed. So China had a healthy population. Health is, of course, so important, not just to be able to do physical labor, but also cognitive power, to be able to learn. And this is what you see in the other aspects of the Chinese good labor, that China also had a literate population before 1980. And this is the census of 1982. And it shows the young people have the literacy, this is percentage of people who are literate, and it's nearly 100%. And for men and women, or boys and girls, and you see how this improved over time. The older people did not have the same literacy, right? So the literacy improved this way, from older to younger people. This is 82. So by 1982, when the survey was done, most of these young people were literate. Again, international comparison of per capita income in log form and share of females enrolled in middle school. And China was much above the international pattern. So to recap, on the eve of China's economic takeoff, China had a healthy, a literate population. This is not just for the urban population. However, Chinese population also had a Chinese characteristic. That's what we called the industrialization without urbanization. So we think China is a modern urban, industrial population now, economy now, but actually in 1978, nearly half of the Chinese economic output measured at the time was from non-farming sector. But if you look at the population who were classified as urban population, was only 20%. In other words, industrialization happened, but not urbanization. And I won't have time here to go into the details of why and how this was created, but the Chinese industrialization was on the backs of the rural population. So in other words, a one country, two systems social arrangement was created. And that played a very important role later on in making the good Chinese labor cheap. To make this point, we have to look at the industrialization, the Chinese industrialization after 1980. So a lot of work has done on the rural industries in the 1990s. Remember, in the 1980s, farmers started to produce much more food for the whole country, right? And then with the increase in labor productivity and output, they have surplus labor, and they have income, and they have capital. So what do? They started to set up what's called the township and the village enterprises. And other people wrote about this, especially Ya-Cheng Huang and Jean Oil, who is also a graduate from Michigan. And a lot of people wrote about migration later on. So I want to connect the two to say these are actually the same people. And I want to revisit the importance of the rural industries. So China, it's now known to be a global export country. And the peak of its export after the Olympics around 2010, 30% of Chinese GDP was from export. 30%. Now has come down to about 20%. But that export boom started after 1980, and especially during this period from 10 to about 20%. Okay. And then look at the contribution from rural industries. 50% of the output were from rural industries. So the shoes you wear, the toys you use, they were not produced by state-owned enterprises. They're all exported, produced by these rural industries. In other countries, in other economies, industrialization and urbanization oftentimes went hand by hand, but not in China. So the Chinese post-1980 industrialization began in the countryside, and what we call industrialization in situ. And there are many political and economic reasons for this. One of them was food coupons were not abolished until the early 1990s. So in other words, cities were shielded against rural migrants before the very little migration, but the big increase is after the mid-1990s. You see the increase in rural migrants, and then the second peak was after the Olympics, right? So now we have about 250 million of migrants in the cities. But early on, it was hard for them to go into the cities and to find jobs, and I won't have time to go into the details. So this is the Chinese characteristics. So the industrialization was confined in the countryside. But when the city was gates opened, migrants started to come into Chinese cities. So the rural population, the majority of the Chinese population, 80%, on the eve of the economic reforms, they first produced in the countryside, and then when opportunities allowed, they came into the cities, and that's where you see urban apartment buildings, airports, bridges, highways are built by almost all of them rural migrant labor. The two segments of the Chinese population enjoyed the age of abundance in very different ways. So in one chapter of the book, I talk about how the two paths. Okay. I did two simple calculations. One is to calculate what's the savings from the cheap labor, just by the discrimination that's created by the Chinese household registration. So one simple way to do this is to assume you take the urban and rural, the migrant and urban employees' average pay over time, and then you assume a percentage of that is due to discrimination. Not all the difference is due to discrimination, because urban and rural labor, they have different profiles. So the assumption, the detailed calculation is in the book, but here I can say the assumption is 25% of that difference is due to what's called discrimination. There are a lot of micro studies, including my own, to document that you control for everything else, migrants are paid more than 25% less. So if you do that, you can actually come up with a number of the total savings of the Chinese cheap labor, and that really fattened the pockets of capitalists. Many of them come from this country, right? So the Chinese labor is made cheap, the good labor, by the Chinese one country, two system arrangement, right? And so this is just one calculation. It's anywhere between 72 to 200 billion USD, and I also gave a sense of what that means in terms of the magnitude. And by the same token, we can look at how rural migrants who could not buy properties in big cities in China, and how the urban Chinese enjoyed a windfall just by being in urban China. So I did the calculation for Beijing and Shanghai, is again using the work by Fang Haiming and others. Just look at the same housing units in 2003 and the same housing units in 2013, in 10 years, and then look at the appreciation, and you divide by the same people, the population also changed, who were residing in 2003, and you see how each person benefited just from this property boom, and that calculation came to about 75,000 for an average person, including a baby, average person in Shanghai, and it's over 100,000 for an average person in Beijing. Again, what's important is that these are the opportunities that are only reserved for people with the household registration and who could buy these properties in the cities where the appreciation occurred, right? So in other words, as a sociologist, we look at how the path to abundance was not enjoyed evenly, and it has the Chinese characteristics. The age of abundance in China has generated enormous surplus, right, for the population wealth. And one way to do this, here I need to acknowledge my collaborators, Professor Shen Ke at Fudan University, and Professor Cai Yong at UNC. We've done this work for 15 years now, using I won't bore you with the technical details, but using a methodology that's called the national transfer accounts, using a life cycle approach. You can actually calculate what's called the life cycle deficit. This is per capita, or surplus, right? At early age of a person's life course, we consume more than we produce, right? The same thing at old age. So you have this. This is called the surplus, the deficit, and then at prime working age, you make more. You have more income than your consumption, and so you have what's called surplus. The net surplus is here minus the two ends of a person's life course, right? I think what you notice here is that between 2002 and 2010, these two curves, there were very little change. Income increased. These are all constant price. Income increased. Consumption increased some. But overall, the surplus was increasing. However, after 2010, you look at how consumption increased for education among young people, and also for elderly people, for health, for healthcare and the pension. And as a result, that's per capita. This is aggregate. you can see the surplus level. This is in trillion RMBs, how the surplus increased drastically from 2002 to 2014. And then by 2018, that surplus has dropped. And this is due to, okay, the gray bars are income. Income is increasing, but consumption, look at the consumption increase, the private consumption. And also public consumption increase. I won't go into the details of what's used here as consumption, but I think the general picture here is that as the age of abundance continues, as people started to consume more, as a younger generation, not like their parents like myself who do not consume, and I do consume, but not everyone. And this is what happens, right? So in other words, the surplus is shrinking. And we did certain projections. Earlier on, we used the 2010 and profile. And with the consumption and income profile then, surplus was expected to continue until 2080. But with the changing consumption profile, the surplus could run out within 10 years. So this is at aggregate level, right? China could increase tax to fund a lot of the stuff, right? But that's a separate topic. Okay, now we come back to the question of is China unique? In the last 40 years or so, China has had the first urbanization increase. And with this rapid increase in urbanization, transfer of farming population into non-farming, we've seen a rapid increase in per capita income. It's over 11 times. It's tremendous, right? And these are all constant monetary terms. But is China unique? This is what happened in South Korea, right? South Korea had, at earlier time, had a urbanization from 30 to 80% and had income increase of per capita of 13 times. Okay, think about it. The income per hour for a farmer is almost too trivial to calculate. But when that person goes in the city to lay bricks, and then the per capita income is multiple, many, many times. So that's what happened in China, in South Korea, and early on in Japan. Right? So the enormous income increase we've seen in China in the last 20, 30 years with urbanization, it's the same what South Korea, what Japan, and many other countries experienced. And you only do this once, from transforming the labor force from farming to non-farming. I will talk about what comes afterwards, right? So in other words, China is not, from the path to abundance to how this had happened is no different from other economies. It's basically is a industrialization with urbanization process. Okay, so as we look forward, after this age of abundance, we have to look at certain headwinds that China faces. The first one is what I call three urbanizations. So China does not have one urbanization, but has three. And so when I think even, right, the Chinese new Prime Minister Li Qiang, who made the statement, I think just a month ago in March in Beijing, saying, oh, we still have a lot of growth potential because we still have 30% of the labor population in the countryside. If you look at this, that's true. But if you look at labor force transformation, China does not have 30% of the population still in the countryside. What the China has is there's 260 million people who do not have local household registration. And among them, it's over 200 million in large cities where they could not, over cities more than 5 million people. And in those cities, they still could not change their status with, to the local residents, which means they do not have the same benefits. They are still treated as secondary citizens. And that is not just an economic issue, it's a social issue as well, right? So what China faces is how to digest this 200 million migrants in the cities and then to provide them with equitable social benefits, and they're treated as others in their own country. So to me, there's not just one urbanization, but there are three of them. And this shows you why China does not have the potential of labor force. And this is from 2020 census. Look at among young people in under age 40-ish. Look at the percentage who are still farming. It's 10%, right? You don't have 30% of the people, you can still move out. This is what you have. And of course, we talk about aging quite often for the Chinese population. And this is one, again, the collaboration we did to calculate what share of the GDP would have to be used to fund pension and healthcare. And assuming China would increase its benefit level, which basically is just to give the rural population more similar provisions as urban population, and that could, the share of GDP used for these expenditures could go up to more than 25% pretty quickly. What does it mean? Currently, the Chinese government revenue is about 25 to 30% of the GDP. So what this means is that all the government revenue, assuming no tax increase, would have to be used for pension and health care and education, and that is a tremendous political test. So Xi Jinping does not have an easy job, just by looking this alone. And this is from a New York Times op-ed page we did a few years ago. The health, well, part of this is the consequence of age of abundance. People are eating better, but part of this is because of aging population. And look at the composition of cause of death. 45% was due to what's called the non-communicable diseases. These are expensive to care, right? Cancer, cardiovascular, and cerebrovascular diseases. And now it's 70%. And that's very similar to a rich country, right? As population ages in China, you're going to see this share to stay high and even higher, and that's unavoidable costs. And not to forget, China has another challenge, which is China has also turned into a paradise for capitalists, and as one of the more or the most unequal societies on Earth. And it's not just income inequality with a Gini coefficient of 0.5 almost, but look at wealth inequality, right? The United States, this is 2000. The United States has a wealth inequality about 0.8. 1 is perfect inequality. So this is very high, United States. Look at China. It's in 2010 is 0.74. It's very close to the US now. And China had only, 20 years of capitalism, right? And wealth inequality has much more social consequences than income inequality. They reset starting lines for the new generation. So, we can talk about billionaires and so on and so forth. So China has all these headwinds to face. Okay, getting there. Now I come back to the four narratives I raised at the beginning. One is that China is unique, right? And then the second is China's growth relied on cheap labor. And the third one I want to emphasize here is that this narrative that reform and opening, this is all very top-heavy. I do not dismiss the importance of institutional building, the reforms. But if you look at, I think this is what I write in the book, if you look at the three transformations that really made a difference in people's standard of living, what they have to eat, what they have to wear, and then where do they live? Okay, so food, clothing, housing. That's by the decollectivization, the household responsibility system in the late 1970s, early 1980s. It's by the rise of rural industries, the TVEs, town and village enterprises, and it's by migrants coming into the cities. None of them was a government initiative. To the contrary, the government tried to suppress them before embracing them. So I do not want to downplay the importance of the shifting in the whole politics agenda, but if you look at what really happened, made the Chinese a country of abundance, and this is what happened. My book actually starts with a chapter called a surprise, and I want to end my presentation here with what I began the book with, which is how unexpected this era of abundance was, right? Chinese leaders, they set ambitious goals. Deng Xiaoping said we need to quadruple our income by year 2000. And then Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao said, we need to double in 10 years. They both underestimated how fast the economy would grow, right? And I'm not making fun of the great economists, but here I have to share with you what they said. So in 2004, the Wall Street Journal conveyed 12 best-known economists, all had Nobel Prize, and asked them in 75 years, by 2019, which economy would become the largest and also with highest per capita income. The United States, China, the EU. And half of the 12 either believed that China would not, in 75 years, in 2079, become the largest economy, or had reservations. So basically, half of them were not so sure, right? Look at what Ankara said. I think the current gap between China, United States, and EU is probably too large to make up. Right? This is Janet Yellen's husband. I think the most thoughtful, careful person was Joseph Stiglitz. He just stepped down as the World Bank's chief economist. So he went to China and he knows much more. And he was very cautious. He said here, it's too difficult to project 70 years from now on those issues, blah, blah, And then basically the results is likely that there will be different balances of economic powers. So even Stiglitz was not so sure China would come out as the largest economy. But look at what happened. By 2014, this is 10 years after this panel of distinguished economists, if you use PPP, China was already the largest economy in the world by 2014. And I just checked yesterday, the day before, the last year, 2022, the latest number, the World Bank estimates China's economy was about 20% larger than the US. So we're in 2022, not 2079. So got to be very careful with doing projections of what happened about history. Not all distinguished economists were so pessimistic. And here we have another one. George, you know this person. This is Robert Fogel. Right before his death, I think in 2010, he wrote this article in Foreign Affairs. I can't read so many zeros here. OK. So basically, he said that by 2040, that's 16 years from now, the Chinese economy would account for 40% of the world total. And he also said the Chinese growth rate would be 10.8% for another 30 years. Now, this is Bob Fogel. And what's more interesting is what he listed as the four factors. Here I highlight number 4. China benefits from an open political system. This was 2010. I don't need to remind you how open China is now, right? So it's very, and also he said, China has a third of rural labor force in reserve. So it's very risky business to try to project history. Now, of course, if you believe in the Chinese leaders, this is very recent. This is just a month ago. And Xi Jinping said China did not collapse as predicted by the China collapse theory, which I agree, nor will the peak as forecasted by the China peak story. Now, I have this discussed with friends on what is considered a peak. If you think of the size of Chinese economy, it's not peaked, right? But if you look at the growth rate, this is when he took over, right? So ever since Mr. Xi took over, this is, this is what's been happening, right? So China faces what's called the gravitational forces, right? Xi Jinping believes that China can defy these economic gravitational forces. And let's look at what happened with Japan after the rapid growth. The growth rate after 1981 averaged 1.5%. South Korea was a better performance at less than 3% after 2001. So would China be so unique that it can continue with 5-6%, let alone Bob Fogel's 10.8% for another, or Justin Yifu Ling's 8% for another 30 years? I leave that to you. And this is my last slide, which is, I think China, myself as a member of coming from China, we're extremely lucky to have had the last 40 years. And the age of abundance changed the lives of 1/5 of humanity. And China is now a major one of the superpowers now. But we're very lucky that China got to this point because of one population, that's the rural population of China, worked so hard. Because of one history, we won't have time to go into this, the Cultural Revolution, and because of one person. History is such that many what-ifs could have been asked. I did so in the book. what if Deng Xiaoping, at advanced age of 87, he was older than Joe Biden, much older, after 1989, what if he was too tired or too weak? He did not go to Shenzhen, did not make that southern tour in 1992, right? What if Deng Xiaoping did not handpick 2 generations of Chinese leaders, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao? For 20 years, there were no political infighting. Well, there were a lot of infighting, but not infighting at the very top level. What if 9/11 had not happened on the soil of the United States? So there are many what ifs that could have set China to a totally different path. So China is lucky, I'm lucky, we're lucky because of one people, one history, one person. Thank you. I leave too little time for questions.
I have a question from the virtual audience. Sorry. Can you discuss how the homeowners in Shanghai and Beijing actually realize the inflation of housing values? That is, does the increase in their home value provide greater income if they are not selling their house?
That's a great question. That wealth is wealth on paper, but for a significant share of the population who has a second home, who were able to invest and to buy and to sell, and that's the ones who can send their children to Ann Arbor and to Boston and to Irvine, to California, right? So that's what happens. And so not every household family sitting on expensive property has that same blessing, but many of them benefited from that gain. Yes, George.
This is a great presentation. It's wonderful. This is sort of a small point, but something I'm wondering about. You know, there was a period of rural industrialization in Europe as well, but it did become more urban. And I'm wondering if one of the preconditions for the rural industrialization in China was electrification. Did China achieve rural electrification before the takeoff?
Great question. I think the 2 points here is that the industrialization in situ also happened in other European and Japan and in other places, but not at this scale, not with such importance. So this is really a large scale. This is not spotted. Electrification, definitely. So in addition to a healthy population, literate population, rural electrification, and also, to some extent, the commune system also laid the foundation because before their dissolutions in the 1980s, the communes all had small factories to repair farming equipment. And so that was actually a good starting point for many of these. That's why it's called township and village industries. But turns out over 90% of them were in the private hands afterwards. And what the importance of these industries, which I wrote in the book, is not just what they produced as goods. They produced the first generation of Chinese entrepreneurs. Right, so thank you.
This is amazing, your lecture. This is a personal question. I don't want you to get involved in it, but I taught in Beijing from 1999 to 2002, and I continue to correspond with some of my students that I had, and I was the Beijing RY. Mm-hmm. And I just wonder what, I never ask them, how are you doing, how much are you making or anything like this. what can they expect from what you've said?
Okay. I'll try to answer this, and I don't know whether this would be a view shared by the people you communicate with. I think this part of history unfolded so fast. So the generations used to be defined by 30, 50 years, now are defined by 10 or even shorter. So depending on the age of your students and the ones who got jobs, got into the property market, and many of them, I think, benefited enormously. There were more opportunities. But if you look at the younger ones, and even the ones you were in touch with, now they face a very different environment. It's in the book. Again, looks like I'm advertising the book. I have a copy I can show you. It's available on Amazon. If you look at the current generation, the state has come back, and young people want to get back into the state sector, but 70% of the employment used to be provided by privately owned businesses, and after the pandemic and with the shift of the power being regained by the state, I think a lot of young people sense the loss of opportunity, so everything is getting so much harder. So basically, this sounds a little pessimistic. It's like if you have made it, you have made it. If you have not, it's a different world now. It'll be very difficult. Yeah. And the property boom is over. Right. Now it's going down, nose down.
The aging of the population and the question you just had, it strikes me that a lot of these young people are one-child family, and they have the burden of taking care of their parents, which has to be a big drag on their futures. No?
Absolutely, it is. Thank you for raising that. There's so much going on, and I didn't even talk about the one-child policy, which actually I spent a lot of time only working on that. We don't really know fully how the only children and their parents are going to adapt to this harsh, man-made reality. We have over 100 million, 150 million household families, about 1 in 3, with only one child, and many of these were forced, right? And we are not just looking at economic support. Again, depending where you are in the Chinese system, you may get good state support if the state does not go bankrupt. And but if you are in the countryside or not in a rich place, you may not be able to count on the state. But what's really important is what called the instrumental and emotional support from children. And the state cannot do that. The robots cannot do that. The AI cannot do that. So China started the one-child policy in the late 1970s, early 1980s. So many of the older parents of the only children are like my sister in their early 70s. They are still not in the very old age. And so my take is that we don't really know fully what kind of cost that the Chinese society would have to pay for this tremendous mistake, policy error that China committed. So we're going to see that. It's definitely very important.
I think we're at time. Please join me in thanking Professor Wang Feng for an illuminating lecture.
Thank you.